Welcome back to Introduction to Talmudic Legal Logic. And in this lecturette, we'll talk about interpretations based on textual proximity. דבר הלמד מעניינו and דבר הלמד מסופו. The Talmud's biblical exegesis holds two principles in tension. The first one is one that we've already talked about a lot when we discussed the supremacy clause of the Talmud, and that is that the Bible is in perfect harmony. There is no early or late in the Bible. You can pick words, expressions, verses, stories, even sometimes individual letters at random from any place in the Bible that you want, and each and every one is going to intertextually relate to another. But there's also another principle that's somewhat in tension with this, and that's the idea that like matters tend to be discussed in proximity to each other. Usually, you will find the first guiding principle, the one that involves any sort of creative, picking something from here, something from there, comparing them to each other, in creative exegetical projects. Like, for example, a midrash will oftentimes use things from a completely different book, completely different context, and bring them to bear upon each other. The other guiding principle, the idea that you look close around in the text for things that are more or less around the same topic, is a guiding principle that characterizes typically a legal or regulative interpretation. Now, I should say these are not absolute rules, but generally speaking, these approaches often apply to these different exegetical enterprises. So when we're talking about legal or regulative stuff, where something is located in the text actually does have some importance. So, this should not really be new to you if you're familiar with the way that modern statutes work. Usually, if you look at a statute, I have here as an example for you the California Penal Code. Statutes are going to have thematically organized subdivisions and sections. So, for example, if you want to look up a specific type of crime, you're going to go to Part 1 on crimes and punishments. And when you click on Part 1, you're going to see a whole series of crime families, sort of. And what you're going to see is that like matters are going to be discussed in proximity to each other. So, for example, take a look at Part 1, Title 13 of the California Penal Code. You're going to see that this deals with property crime, and each chapter includes various provisions that belong to the same family of crimes. So, all the arsons are going to be in Chapter 1. All the various permutations of burglary are going to be in Chapter 2. They're sort of dripping into Chapter 3. So if you want to look at that, you're going to look in the vicinity of Chapter 2 or something like that. You know where to look. You know that more or less everything that's in that chapter is going to relate roughly to the same topic. Biblical rules work very, very similarly. Now, not everything in the Torah, of course, is about rules, but there are big chunks of the Torah that do have rules. For example, there's big chunk of rules in Exodus, you find lots of rules in Leviticus, and lots of rules in Deuteronomy. So, if you were, for example, to look for rules involving leprosy, you can be pretty sure that if you went to Leviticus 14:1 to 15:33 to Parashat Metzorah, you're going to find a lot of rules about leprosy, and they're all going to hang out around there. This doesn't mean there are never going to be any references to leprosy anywhere else, but it's just that typically you're going to go there, and just like in a modern statute, you expect to find things on roughly the same topic in roughly the same place. This is helpful to us because it can provide a good tool for clarifying rules based on their textual proximity. There are basically two approaches, and as you'll find out, they're pretty similar to each other. One of them we're going to call a thing learned from its own matter, davar halamed mi'inyano, and the other one we're going to call a thing learned from its end, davar halamed misofo. Don't get too hung up on this because these are very, very similar to each other, but let me walk you through both, and you'll see how the textual proximity sheds light on the nature of a particular legal rule. So the idea is that in a given legal section, for example, let's say that there are 5 rules. And let's say that of all the rules in that particular legal section, we're really interested in Rule 4, right? So we're trying to find out what Rule 4 is about. So using this method, a thing learned from its own matter, we're going to go to the legal section that Rule 4 is located in, right? So we want to figure out what this legal section addresses, and maybe that's going to give us a clue about the content or the context of Rule 4. One thing that we can do is we're going to look at the other rules that are in the same legal section. We're going to try to figure out whether there's any elucidation in those rules that explains what they're about. What do they apply to? And if we can generalize something, if we can figure out something in these rules that tells us what they're about, that might also explain something about Rule 4, because Rule 4 probably also involves the same topic or application as the other rules in the same legal section. So that's the way that the Varalamed Minyano works. And now let's take a look at an example. And we're going to take one that you're probably familiar with, the classic rule from Exodus 20:13, thou shall not steal, lo tignov. So the question about thou shall not steal is, what do you mean, not steal? Not steal what? Is this a prohibition on stealing people? Thou shalt not steal people. In other words, don't kidnap people. Or is this a prohibition against stealing money, right? Which we would call today larceny. So which is it? Is this a prohibition of kidnapping or a prohibition of larceny? Let's try to figure it out. So, as you probably know, the rule thou shalt not steal is located in the Ten Commandments. It's actually the eighth commandment. There it is. Let's take a look at some of the other commandments, right? So here are some of the neighbors of thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not murder, and thou shalt not commit adultery, right? If we're trying to figure out what these things are about, the prohibition against murder and adultery, they're both serious prohibitions. Both of these things are punishable by death in the Bible, right? Which means these are major crimes. These are severe crimes. And they are in proximity, they are the neighbors of thou shalt not steal. So, our commandment is discussed alongside like matters, which suggests that it probably has the same level of severity as those other things, right? The Ten Commandments are a big deal, right? So, we deduce from this, and if you take a look, you'll see that kidnapping is punishable by death, whereas stealing money is punishable by a fine, which means that in the context of Exodus 20:13, thou shalt not steal probably means no kidnapping. It probably means don't steal people. Because this just makes sense in the context of the overall text of the Ten Commandments. Now, not to worry, in case you were thinking, well, how can this be that the Torah doesn't forbid you to steal money? Not to worry, there is a different source for the prohibition to steal money. You can find it somewhere else in the Bible, in Leviticus 19:11. So this is an example of how we've learned about the content of this rule, thou shalt not steal, what it refers to, from its textual location in the Ten Commandments. So now let's take a look at the sister rule, a thing learned from its end, davar halamed misofo. What we do in this scenario is basically we continue on reading the legal section to look at a rule that is mentioned later in the same section and then learn what the earlier rule was about. So in this situation that we have here, I'm interested in Rule 1. I want to decipher what Rule 1 refers to, right? So I'm going to look at Rule 2, which follows Rule 1 or is more toward the end of the legal section. And there could be some elaboration over there, and that probably suggests that because these two rules are in the same section, they're probably about the same thing. Let's take a look at an example. This is a charming example from Leviticus 14:34, and the question here is, how do we deal with a house that's been struck by leprosy? So here is the beginning of this discussion in Leviticus, and this verse says, כי תבואו אל ארץ כנען, אשר אני נותן לכם לאחוזה, ונתתי נגע צרעת בבית ארץ אחוזתכם. When you enter the land of Canaan that I give you as a possession, and I inflict an eruptive plague upon a house in the land you possess. So I'm interested in trying to figure out what upon a house means. What does it mean to infect a house with leprosy? And in this context, one of the things I might be wondering about is what kind of house? Does a tent count, or only an actual house that's made of stone and timber and cladding? Well, let's find out. So, this particular verse appears in the context of the leprosy rules in Leviticus. And if you continue to read in this leprosy rules section, you're going to come across Leviticus 14:45, which says, "The house shall be torn down, its stones and timber and all the coating on the house, and taken to an impure place outside the city." So, the instructions of what to do with this house that's been struck by leprosy refer to stone and timber and cladding. That suggests that both of these rules deal with the same type of house, a house of stone, timber, and cladding. This is not explicitly explained in the first rule, but we are learning about it from the next rule or from a later rule in the same legal section. Now, as you've noticed, the two maneuvers that I've done here, the thou shalt not steal and the leprosy house, they're very similar, right? And because of that, some Talmudic scholars treat the thing that's learned from its end rule as a specific application of a thing learned from its own matter rule. Others treat it as two separate rules. When and how to apply which, or where do you go to look for what it is that you want to deduce, this can be a point of argument. And as you've already learned, as with many Talmudic arguments, there is not necessarily a correct answer.